Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a Premier Field Engineer specializing in system-centered technologies. Today's discussion is part 4 of an ongoing series dealing with image deployment in Configuration Manager 2012. Today's discussion will build on the previous 3 now that we've worked through the process of understanding OSD, understanding the capture options, going through and capturing an image. Now it's time to continue those learnings and actually deploy an image that we capture. So I really want to break this into 2 sections. One is to talk about some concepts in OSD, and the other is then to talk about the options for deployment in OSD. So let's spend some time here. So a few topics that I want to hit really quick. I'll pull the lab in and out as we go along. The first one is the idea of a known versus an unknown computer. So this is a really important thing to understand, because as you go through Config Manager, start to learn about it, there will be differences about what you can deliver, how you can deliver it, depending on whether you use known or unknown. So at the base definition, a known computer is one that is known to Config Manager, meaning it is a system in the database. It is doesn't have to be a full client, could be just a skeleton record, really, but it is a system that's known. So let me show you what I mean by a known system. So you'll see me use this system as we go through a little bit in future demos. But I've got a system here called, supposed to be Test OSD BM for bare metal. This is not a Config Manager client. We don't know whether it's a computer or not. It's not a client. We have it assigned to the CAS, which in Config Manager 2012 we know is not possible, and it's not active. So if you look at this machine, you'll see that there are some details about this, really just the basic entries. You'll see manual machine entry, which means that I had to manually import this. We'll show you how to do that in just a minute, right? You'll see other things like the MAC address, right? The name, and some other few details. Nothing really significant. Yeah, we have the GUID assigned, but there's another process that kind of does that, right? So this is a record that I imported into Config Manager. I wanted to make this machine known, so it was in the database, so I could then move it around in collections and maybe assign variables to it and different things. Some of those variable things we'll talk about in future sessions. But without a known machine, I'm a bit more limited in what I can do. So being known also is a more secure way to do imaging, right? So if you have a system that is known in Config Manager, you are essentially validating that it is a system that should be managed, should be imaged. Whereas if you're doing unknown support, that by definition means that the system is not known to Config Manager. It could be a completely foreign system that comes out of a box as a new machine from the OEM, plugs in to the network and gets an image. That's a valid scenario. It could be a vendor, as an example, coming in with a blank machine, plugging into your network and trying to get an image, right? Certainly having unknown in the equation makes that possibility easier than having it known, right? So more about unknown in just a minute. But in terms of making a system known, well, certainly if it's already in the database, if it's an active client, then it's known by the fact it's currently managed. If it's not, then there's a process that we can go through to import it. So if I click on Devices, you'll see this option up here to, where'd it go? To import the machine. Oops. Here, let me go back down here. Saw it in the menu, there it is. Why am I not seeing this? Oh, here, sorry, my bad, it was hidden there. So import a computer information, right? So I have a choice. I can either use a file or just import the single computer. Using a file is easy if you're getting a bulk shipment from an OEM and you want to use a file that they can provide to you, whatever. It is an easy way to go. But if you're just doing a one-off like I did in that case, you can import a single machine. Well, you notice that it looks like there are 3 criteria that are necessary to import a machine. Certainly you need to have a computer name, but you only need one or the other of these. You either need a MAC address or an SMBIOS GUID. MAC address is most common because it's easiest to obtain. SMBIOS GUID would work just as well. And the point of this is, whenever a system boots up to begin the imaging process, a bare metal system, the process will look in the Config Manager database and try to identify a known system by either MAC address or SMBIOS. if we find a match on MAC address or SMBIOS, then we're going to stop looking and try to do whatever task sequences are deployed, whatever images are deployed to that system. Right? That's the way it works. Doesn't matter what the computer name is, doesn't matter anything else about the system. It's the MAC address or the SMBIOS. Right? Well, there's a few challenges that can come up here that I'll just mention as informational here. There's going to be a troubleshooting section later on in this series. Now, I'll mention it to you now. So certainly MAC addresses and SMBIOS addresses by definition should be unique. Well, there are situations where they're not. So for example, in virtual machine environments is most commonly where I see duplicated SMBIOS addresses or identifiers. If you have a duplicated SMBIOS, sometimes it'll trip us up. We don't expect a duplicated SMBIOS, and so whenever we go do a match, and you'll see that process of matching here in a minute, when we go do a match on the SMBIOS and query our database to find a matching record for SMBIOS, we're going to stop at the very first match we find. Well, if the very first match we find is machine A, but you're actually expecting machine B, you put machine B in the collection and are targeting to machine B the deployment of the task sequence, the image, we're never going to get to machine B. So we're going to look at the collections machine A is in, because now once we identify the machine, we're going to use the client GUID as our unique identifier throughout the rest of the system. Once we identify the machine that we match on and have the client GUID, we're going to look and see what all is deployed to that client. Well, in machine A's case, you've not deployed anything to that client. You did it for machine B, so we're going to come back and say no task sequence is available. Whereas if we did not have the duplicate, we would have arrived at machine B and realized the things that were targeted to machine B through the various collection membership, and we would have been okay. Right, so that's one scenario. Another scenario that happens really mainly with tablets these days, Windows tablets, could happen with PCs too, is where customers use a dongle, an Ethernet dongle, to connect to these machines. So these Ethernet dongles will have their own unique MAC address, which is exactly what's supposed to happen. And what customers have done is they will maybe take a Surface or any other tablet or whatever, and they will start the imaging process with machine A. Well, once that machine goes, they'll go on to machine B with the same dongle and try to start that up. Well, the problem is that MAC address has already been registered to the machine that was just imaged. And so when we go try to look at that MAC address, we find a match, and we blow up at that point. We don't likely have, we might not have any longer an image deployed to that machine that has already finished the imaging process. Right? There's some mechanical details behind the scenes, but that's the problem. Well, there's ways out of it and ways you can deal with it. Really, you want to have the MAC address unique, which it is in the case of the dongle, and one of the ways to get around it is, since we've moved the dongle from PC1 to PC2 or Tablet 1 to Tablet 2, Tablet 1 no longer has that dongle. If you force a hardware inventory, it's going to report that it no longer has that dongle, therefore the entry in the database will be cleared out. Right? And then you can move on to machine 2 and it's fine. But that is a challenge that customers face, right? And this process. The other thing, so that's really it for known. Known is one that's in the database already. Well, I really coach customers to use known where they can. There are some scenarios where using known is just not a workable option, right? So there is an option to use an unknown computer support. So just like known computers are ones that are known to ConfigMgr, unknown computers are ones that are not known to ConfigMgr. So back in the day, around SMS 2003, known or unknown computers, that wasn't a big deal to image. You just imaged them right away, no big deal, and they were treated the same, right? But for security reasons, as we've kind of already talked about, we really want to prefer known systems. In fact, we didn't really have support for unknown systems in early stages of ConfigMgr 2007. We added it because of customer demand, but we didn't have it. We do now, and in fact, it's on by default now. And you see some entries for unknown computers. You can see that there's 2 from every site. There's actually a few from PR1 and a couple from PR2. Right? No big deal. So if you have unknown computer support enabled, what you end up doing is deploying your images, your task sequences, to all unknown computers collection. And that way, whenever the system comes online and tries to go through the matching process, it doesn't find a match specific to its MAC address or its SMBIOS GUID, and so will default over to the unknown computers collection if that's enabled. If unknown computer support is enabled, you'll see where to enable it in a couple of places here in a minute. And that works. It works beautifully, right? The risk that you run, again, there's a little bit more of a perceived security risk. There's also just additional imaging risk. I'll tell you a story that happened to me, frankly, whenever I was dealing with OSD early on, around 2003, 2007 days. I can't remember. But I had set up my lab, and in my lab, it was on the corporate network. It wasn't supposed to be. I knew that, really. It's been years ago. And I had turned on Pixie. And I had also turned on unknown computer support. And because of that, I had a image deployed to my unknown computers. Fortunately, it was available and not required. And so I had a colleague of mine that was rebooting and hit my Pixie server because Pixie was first in their BIOS boot up list, and got my boot media loaded onto their machine. And if I would have had that image set to required, which we'll talk about this more in a minute, they would have started imaging their production workstation, which would not have been good. And there are stories of that happening with corporations, various corporations. Occasionally, something like that will pop up and happen. And that's just a known thing with unknown computers. Not that it's inherent, not that it's dangerous. If you work with it right, it's great. But there are some additional risks associated, which is why for anyone dealing with imaging to begin with, I never recommend using required task sequences or deployments of any kind. Whether doing bare metal, whether doing Pixie, whether doing Reimage, it makes no difference. Once you understand how the process works, then you can use required in a safe way, but not at first, right? And I'm jumping ahead of myself. But you'll hear some more about that in a minute, but just to talk about it. So unknown computer support works well. Here's the collection for it. And if you want to deploy to unknown computers, you do have to have that turned on, which you'll see in a minute. And then you can deploy here. It's not as flexible as known computers. There's some limitations in terms of how you assign variables and the kinds of things you can do with them. But it still has some really good uses in some scenarios. A lot of customers use this, right? Okay. So another piece, there's a few more pieces. I'll hit these very quickly. So we have the network access account, the collection, distribution point, and content. So let me just pull the lab in. I will hit all of those together as we walk through. So in terms of the network access account, when you image a system, a significant portion of that imaging happens inside Windows PE. Well, when you're inside Windows PE, there's really no concept of user-based security. It's really all done under the context of the local system that's running this, right? Well, that works in some cases, but in some cases, we don't have the credentials that are necessary to reach the network resources that we might need to reach to do imaging. Maybe there's some shares out there that we don't have rights to. They're non-standard ConfigMgr shares, whatever, right? So if we did not have alternate credentials, the process would just fail. So, but thankfully, we do have alternate credentials, and we talk about this specifically being useful during operating system deployment. That's certainly true. And we can specify multiple network access accounts. Well, multiple network access accounts in terms of ConfigMgr 2012 R2. Prior to that, we could just have one. But the point is, you put the network access accounts in here. They're made available to systems as they image. And if there's a place that we hit where we don't have the credentials with the system account to get what we need, we'll substitute the network access account. And then if it's R2 systems, we'll rifle through the various network access accounts that are provided to find one, hopefully, that works for us. So this is where you configure it. All right. So other things here in terms of deploying the task sequence, the image, we do that like we do any other kind of deployment. We target it to a collection. So you will see that my deployment targets all systems, and it also targets OSD demo. So the reason I do that is because, as I showed you a minute ago, I have a bare metal system that I imported into this collection. It is not in my Windows 8 collection. It could be. Just chose to not put it there so you can see the difference. And I'm going to do bare metal imaging against specifically this machine. But when it comes time to do image-based deployment, or sorry, Reimage type deployments, I'm going to do it against the Windows 8 collection that I created for OSD demo, which is right here, and has my existing Windows 8 client as a member. Right? So just a little different. I didn't have to do it this way, but just to break it up and show you the difference, I wanted to go ahead and set it up that way. All right. So collections definitely we deploy to, just like with any collection. You can go to properties and see the task sequences that are deployed. So I have Windows 8 OSD, a couple of them deployed here. All right. So we'll see that more in a minute. And then in terms of content, the content that you need as part of the deployment process definitely needs to be in place on a distribution point. So if we go look at our distribution points, I just have one. But if you look at it, you can confirm your content is available on your distribution point by looking at your content list, right? And then we'll get to this in a minute, but you'll see Pixie. Right? Every distribution point, every full distribution point has the option of being a Pixie server. It doesn't have to be. If you're going to use a distribution point as a Pixie server, at the very least, you need to have your boot images on that Pixie server, right? And then you can put other stuff there if you want to, but at the very least, it needs to be a Pixie or a boot images, right? All right. Now, in terms of what content needs to be here, one of the nice things about a task sequence, if you go to Software Library and look at the task sequence, you'll see a tab down here that shows you the references, the content that is necessary for this to this task sequence to run. And you'll see that I have 100% compliance across all of them. So I definitely have all of these on a distribution point somewhere that hopefully my machine will be able to access as I roll along, right? Okay. So then the key part of imaging is going to be the deployment. Just like any kind of distribution or any kind of software that you would want to put out, or settings even, or compliance items, anything you want to make available to the clients, very often you're going to have a deployment that you do, right? Certainly the same is true with task sequencing. So there's a few pieces of the deployment that are interesting to talk about. So I want to walk through creating a deployment. I've already got them created, so I'm not going to save it. But I definitely want to walk through the process of creating a deployment so you can see it. All right, so let me go into my task sequence. You see that I have a couple of deployments already created here, right here. So let me just go create another one. So I'm going to say deploy and work through this. So the first thing that comes up is most things you can deploy to both a device and a user collection. You cannot do that with OSD. So one of the customers I work with had a question about, we want to make imaging available to users. So whenever they go to the application catalog, they can see images available to them that they might want to deploy. You can't do that at all. You can't target users. Now, there's ways around it. You can kind of fudge it, but by default, you can't target users. And it doesn't make sense to anyway, because imaging happens in the context of the system. Again, you could kind of trick it if you wanted to, but most scenarios wouldn't need that. Using system is fine. So when you target it to a device collection, I'll just pick one that I haven't picked yet. Certainly, it will show up in the Software Center if you allow it to. And then users can start it from there, right? You just can't get it into Application Catalog. So I'll choose this and click Next, and then I'm presented with an option, either available or required. So as I mentioned before, I strongly urge you, as you're starting to work with OSD, to use available. That way it does not force the deployment on a machine. You can control it, you can learn what it does, and at some point you might want to switch it over to required. The thing about it, intuitive, if you set it to be available, that means that you're going to have the user interact. So one of the nice things, one of the uniquenesses of OSD is it can run completely zero touch. So can MDT, it can do zero touch. But OSD was engineered to be zero touch. There's a few more openings where you can make it light touch these days. Required is a zero touch thing. So if you have a required deployment and it's the only required deployment to a collection of the machines in, that's going to run. It's not even going to stop. It's just going to go, right? And so that's a little bit more dangerous, and you want to be sure you know what you're doing when you do it. So testing with available and having it available in some scenarios, even in production, is a good thing, right? All right, so I mentioned if there's just one task sequence deployed and it's required, it will start right away. That's true. If there's a couple of task sequences that are required that are deployed to your machine, then we're not going to know which one to run. So we're still going to have to stop and ask, right? But that's at least something to know. All right. Next section, or the next thing, I'm just going to go ahead and say available, is this thing called make available to the following. So this is really interesting, gives a lot of decent flexibility. So in previous versions of Config Manager, you did have some flexibility, but certainly not even the flexibility this gives you. There's more options here. So in some cases, you might want to have some task sequences that are only intended to be used by existing clients, maybe an uplift, maybe an XP to 7 kind of uplift. Existing machines that are existing Config Manager clients, and you want to send deployments to them that will allow them to image up or re-image or whatever, but you know it's going to start in a running system, one that's already a Config Manager client. In that case, you could choose to make those certain task sequence deployments only available to Config Manager clients. So users of those systems might not, or wouldn't have the option to make a mistake and choose the wrong one, right? Conversely, there could be task sequences that you know will only ever be available for imaging bare metal. And so you could choose those, so Pixie and Boot Media, the only choice where those would show up, right? Or you could do all three. Or the last option here, which is interesting and new to 2012, is the option for bare metal, but hidden. Maybe there's something you want to image bare metal, but you don't want it to be something users can select. They would need to know it's there. And there's certainly some ways to do that. And this last deployment option gives you that ability. All right. Oops, didn't mean to do that here. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to save it. Actually, I do want to set this right now. All right, next. And so this would be the time that you set it up. This one is new for 2012. So in previous versions, we did not allow OSD to systems that were on the internet. Now we do. So if you want to do internet-based imaging, there's some nuances around that, but it's certainly possible with this option. And then the last option here is deployment option, download content, how we download content. So the default is download the content when it is needed by the running task sequence. So as the task sequence runs at certain places, we're going to look at the content we need, make sure it's available, download it on the fly, that kind of thing. The other option here, though, is an interesting one because it allows you to prepare for imaging, plan imaging, and respect the network load at the same time. So if you have a re-image type scenario, an existing client, has to be an existing Config Manager client that you want to deploy an image to, like an uplift, that XP to Windows 7 kind of thing we talked about. You could easily deploy that image to the machine, make it available, make it required for a certain point of time in the future, and then as that image comes down, it will begin to download the content that it needs, and it will store it locally. So when it does come runtime, or when a technician hits run for that required deployment, maybe even ahead of time, the content for that will already be staged on the hard drive, and things will go a lot smoother. We won't have to reach out to the network, and we'll just run locally, right? Now, that option is not even available unless you're doing a Config Manager client install. An image to Config Manager clients. So, if you do Pixie and Media only, you'll notice that option isn't even here. Because if you don't have a Config Manager client, there's really not a way to stage the content ahead of time. Yeah, there are some tricks you can do to make some things happen, but by default, there's no way to really get it done here. All right, so I'm going to cancel that. I don't want to create that deployment, but that will give you at least kind of an idea of what these deployments do. All right. Now, so let's pull the lab out for a minute, and let's turn the page here. So that's kind of setting up the components or the concepts, right? And the demo I've kind of been doing all along. Now, the components, that's maybe not the right term to use, but basically the ways that we can deploy images, the options, maybe is what I should have used, are here. Large 30,000 foot view, we can either do bare metal imaging or we can do deployment initiated imaging. I'm going to walk through these, take more time on the first one, the boot media, that I'm going to walk through and just show you how we would create these things and then show it to you working. And then after the first one, I'll speed up a little bit, I think. We'll see. And go from there. But I want to show you all of these working. Remember, so we talked about, as we got started with the series, the things that we're doing in OSD, the imaging actions that we're doing in OSD, really nothing here is special, except that OSD makes it easier. You could just as easily deploy these images and so on using the ADK tools. The nice thing about OSD is it marries together the ADK tools, makes it easier to use, marries together some of the functionality in OSD that's already there, right? So it's a really nice unified way to approach imaging. So let's look at boot media first. So pulling back in the lab, first thing I want to do is just talk through how would we do boot media, right? So the goal of imaging, in all the things that I'm going to show you, the goal of imaging is to get into Windows PE. Windows PE is a small RAM-based version of Windows that does not occupy the hard drive, that allows you to have access enough to the system to manipulate the system and deploy images and make changes and so on. Windows PE is very small. If you look at our boot images, all these is Windows PE, right? So when I go create my task sequence media, there's a couple of options here. One of them is for bootable media. All this is a way to get Windows PE onto a system that you can then leverage that PE to access the environment. So you look at those boot images, they might not look like Windows PE to you. Whenever you boot those boot images, as we will in a minute, they may not look like Windows PE to you because there are a few customizations in there to allow ConfigMgr to do what it needs to do and access its own environment, right? But at a base, all it is Windows PE. So as we go through this wizard to create the boot media, which again will result just in media, bootable media, that will contain Windows PE with a few customizations, first thing we have to ask is whether we want dynamic or site-based media. This is new in ConfigMgr 2012. In ConfigMgr 2007 and before, there was really no option. It was only the only option was that you had site-based media. What did that mean? So in 2007, ConfigMgr 2007, whenever you created a boot media, it was specifically operational against the site that created it. So if you have primary A, B, C, D, and you create boot media on primary A, and then try to use it on primary C, it'll fail because it's hard-coded to primary A. Well, that in a hierarchy gets to be a little bit painful because you have to keep all of these unique boot media disks and so on. So in 2012, we gave the ability to have dynamic media, which means you could create it at primary A in that example and go over to primary C and it uses it, no problem. Behind the scenes, it's still kind of doing static media stuff, but there's some additional front-end work that happens behind the scenes to help us find the owning site and then proceed that way, right? One thing to understand, the key thing to understand with dynamic media versus standalone or static. If you use dynamic media, you must have your boundaries in order. Because the first thing dynamic media does as it boots is it's going to go look and try to figure out what site the client that you're on is really supposed to be a part of and associate it with that site and start to factor that in. Whereas with static media, it doesn't matter. We don't care about boundaries. So even if you're good with your boundaries, you could come up with a situation where a system has problems with dynamic media just because maybe the boundaries are not totally configured right. Whereas static media, it works just the same as it did in 2007, right? And so the only place that dynamic media makes a lot of sense to me is in a hierarchy. Other than that, if you have a standalone primary, just use static because that's the only site you're going to really be imaging against anyway, right? So I'll go ahead and use dynamic because it's selected. Go forward. It's going to ask me to create a media file. So I will just tell it boot.iso. I already have this created, so I'm not going to create it. But notice you have a choice. You can either create a CD, DVD set, or if you have a USB flash drive, you can choose that as well. Just plug it into the system, running the console, and we can create it for you. Here I don't have it, so I'm just going to create the ISO file. Now, once I create this ISO file, you would, for physical systems, typically burn that to a CD or a DVD. Whereas with virtual machines, you can just use that ISO file directly, which you'll see me do in just a minute. So I'm going to click Next, and then notice, by default, unknown computer support is enabled. I can turn that off if I don't want it. Also, by default, protecting with the password is enabled. I can turn that off if I don't want it. Right? There's some UDI type stuff in here too. Now I need to choose what boot image I want, because at the end of the day, all this is is a boot. It's a mechanism to launch this boot image and get it going. What distribution points this boot image is on, have it here. So I'm good. So, and then the other thing I have to do, this is dynamic media, so I have to tell it what management points I want this media to be able to access. I just have one in this case, so I just choose one. But if I had more than one from multiple sites, it would display those, and I could choose which ones I want to work against. Right? All right, so click Next. Now, the last page, this is where I can do some customization. So if you wanted, for example, certain variables, which we haven't talked about variables yet, but certain variables to be available to the task sequence when we boot from media, then you could put them in here and we would include those variables and make them available to the task sequence. The other thing you can do here is enable a pre-start command. So ConfigMgr was designed, imaging was designed to be hands-off, zero touch. But there are places where it makes sense to have some user interaction. So you can enable a pre-start command. Actually, the pre-start command doesn't have to require the user interaction at all, depending on what you do. But some command that we want to run before imaging starts. So a lot of customers will put like an HTA, a little graphic that pops up GUI that folks can enter information into. They'll save that as variables in the environment and then move on with imaging. Right? That's where you would do it, is to add this. Now, I will tell you, be very careful what path you use here, because if you use a path that is not really specific to what you're trying to do, like if you put in Windows as the directory, it's going to store everything in Windows. If you put in, like I did once, my desktop, because I had the HTA I was working with on my desktop, it's going to store everything on my desktop, which ended up being a 10 gig image for this media. It's not what you want, so be careful about that. Right? I'm not going to do anything here. I would click Next. It gives me a summary. It would go about creating that boot media, which I've actually got created already. So I will move on. Right. Now, I want to show you this boot media in action. So if I move in my bare metal machine, and I'm going to go into File Settings and go into my DVD drive and browse to my boot media, which is right here, hit OK, and then I'm going to go start this machine. So you'll see that it's going to come up in Pixie Boot first. Quickly pay attention to the MAC address 2103B at the end. Right. I'm not going to respond to this. I'm just going to let it go, and now I'm going to hit a key because I want to boot from the ISO file. So here we go, we're booting. This is just going to load Windows PE. And what I'm going to do, in my case, I've enabled the command prompt. So I'm going to go ahead and hit F8, which opens the command prompt. One thing to understand about the command prompt, it's great for troubleshooting. It gives access to the system that you probably don't want your users to have when the images are deploying live, but it's great for troubleshooting. As that window's open, the system won't reboot, right? So normally, right, if you use like a WinPE reboot command, it will. But normally it'll just be a way to preserve your position and not go through the reboot. So just bear that in mind as you're working with it, right? So I've got this open. Now, I'm going to go forward and click Next. And what I'm going to find is there's this task sequence to deploy. I haven't started deploying it yet. I can click Next. I will in a minute. But as I have done that, I want to show you what's happened. I'm just quickly going to dabble in the log. We'll talk about troubleshooting and logging and such in a section later. Just know for now that the log does move around while you're doing imaging. While you're in Windows PE, it tends to stay in the same place, which will be where I show you. And I want to show you what's happened so far. Also note that I'm on the X drive. That's a RAM drive. This is Windows PE that I'm in. It's just got a shell that we're using through ConfigMgr. So let me do this. All right, so that's where the logs are. And I'm in Notepad. So if I expand this, come on, and work down a little bit. So a few key things. Again, you can read this if you really want to know how OSD works. This logging is fantastic, and it will show you step by step how it works. But a couple of things. First of all, in the logs, we will tell you how we booted, whether we're Pixie, whether we're booting from removable media, whether we're booting from full media. All of that is listed here. All right. Then as we roll down, we'll see a little bit more as we try to figure out our environment. Okay. The key thing is at some point we're going to have to ask the site if the system is known. Right. Here we see that unknown computer support is enabled. Right. and then we'll go through a position where we're trying to find out about our system. So we're getting MP info and things right here, right? And then now we're preparing a client identity request. Here's the source ID, SM BIOS GUID. Here's the MAC address, that 210.3b that I called your attention to whenever I booted. All right, and now we're executing that request. We're sending that client identity request to our management point. And you'll notice that we did in fact get back a response. So here is the client GUID that matches up to our request. Now, so this is a known machine. If this weren't a known machine, we would see that in the log and we would see some additional processing to try to see if there's anything deployed to unknown computers. Right? But since we are a known machine, we found out what's deployed to us and we stopped. And then off we go. Right? Now you'll see that since we figured that out, we're going to download all the policy for that known machine, which is not just limited to OSD policy. It's all the policy. And then we're going to sort through anything that applies to us. And you're going to see here downloading the body, policy body. So we download kind of the metadata, if you will, for the policy, the 59. Then we'll download the policy body that tells us what to do because we recognize this as the deployment for OSD, as a task sequence that's available. Right? So we download that, and then we start running through and getting ready. Now, I haven't kicked it off, but we've activated the task sequence collection page, and so on. That's as far I'm going to go into the logs right now, but I will go ahead and say next and click it off. So now we're just we're downloading a boot WIM. I probably didn't choose the right one here. That's okay. OSD takes care of it. We're downloading the boot WIM. We'll reboot in a minute. I'll let that process work so you can see the whole thing. And then we'll start the imaging. And you'll see that really this experience is pretty much identical in all of the bare metal imaging. In fact, this experience really is identical. Even if you start from a running OS, it's just some of the options aren't presented to you because you've kind of already chosen them by the fact that you've kicked off a certain image, right? So I'm going to reboot. It's ready to go. Reboot, and let's see what happens. Should come up in PE. I will keep my hands off the keyboard so I don't interfere with it as it boots. Only place I'll do it is to hit escape to get past that. Besides that, I will let it do its thing, and it will come up. And off it comes. Here's PE booting. Loading up. Preparing, and we should start right away as soon as we're up and running into imaging. And off we go. There it goes. So we're imaging the machine right now, right? And that's as far as I'm going to let it go. Again, we don't need to go through it in detail. All this is a really basic image. So let me go ahead and turn this off. It's a really basic image. So this one is the one we're deploying. This is one that Wizard created. I didn't modify it at all. It's just very, very basic, right? Okay. So another type of way that we can do bare metal that's very common in a lot of organizations is to use Pixie. Well, so Pixie to ConfigMgr is very similar to the way we think of WSUS, right? So in ConfigMgr, the WSUS server is one that we need for the binaries and things that we need to do with WSUS, but we lay our code on top of it and call it a software update point. So our code interacts with the WSUS server. We leverage some of the stuff in the WSUS server. Our code controls it, and it's a software update point. Well, for the Pixie server, we require WDS. So WDS has the components that we leverage, and then we lay our code on top of it and actually work with the WDS binaries and so on to get the job of imaging done. So let me start there. So WDS first has to be installed, and it is actually on this server. So let me just show you on the root of the C drive. Here's my remote install folder. If you look, there's definitely the SMS boot pieces, and you can go in here and see some of the Pixie Boot stuff that we put on there. Going back another level, we have our SMS images. So these are our boot images. This is the boot image, CAS005 for the x64, right? And so on, right? So this is on the primary site server. I just put it all in one, right? So remote install folder is definitely there. WDS is definitely there. We didn't configure WDS. We let ConfigMgr do that whenever we put the DP or enable the DP for Pixie. So let's go there now. So, well, before I go there, so another requirement for Pixie, and if I had one to configure fresh, you'd see it whenever you first go to create a Pixie server. So say that you go to a distribution point. Here, here I have the distribution point. If I go to the distribution point, hit properties, and then go into Pixie and tell it enable, I'm going to get a pop-up that says, okay, warning. So if the WDS server, the Pixie server you're trying to build, is on the same server as a DHCP server, there's some port conflicts. You've got to resolve those, right? In production, most of the time, Pixie and DHCP, WDS, DHCP are not on the same box. So you don't have to make any provisions in DHCP for WDS for Pixie. Right, that's the warning. If you have them shared, you've got to. If you don't, you don't. So like in a lab, you might have them shared, but in production, most likely you don't. All right. Now, so if I want to turn this distribution point onto a Pixie server, I can. Any full distribution point can be a Pixie server. And so if I set these options, you'll see that I have the same kinds of things. I can either allow this to respond to Pixie request or not. Maybe you're in maintenance, you don't want to allow this to respond to Pixie, you can turn that off temporarily. I can enable unknown computer support if I want to for this. I can require a password, right? Just like I did when I created the boot media. Then I have some user device affinity things. I can also specify what network interfaces I want this server to respond on. So if I'm a production server, I might have 4 NICs. 2 of them might be for a private network. 2 of them might be for the public network. Maybe I don't want the 2 that are private to even try to respond because they're not going to get any Pixie requests, so I'll just turn those off. The other 2, I might want both of them to respond to Pixie, so I'll leave both of those enabled. Here I just have 1 NIC, so no big deal, but I'm telling it on all interfaces. If I want just one, then I can say what MAC address I want it to respond on, right? Either way. And then there's an option to have Pixie delay its response. So there are some interesting scenarios where you might have a Pixie server that is kind of co-working with another Pixie server. So I think of a Linux environment maybe, where you have a Linux Pixie server and then you have a Windows Pixie server, WDS, and you might want the Windows Pixie server to only respond if the Linux one doesn't, or vice versa, right? Or you could have a WDS server that is not ConfigMgr related, and you only want that second WDS server to respond if the first one that is ConfigMgr bound doesn't provide service to the machine that's booting, Pixie booting. So you could have these 2 in tandem, and you could have one of them set to automatically respond, no wait, like this one is, 0, and then the other one to delay 10 seconds. So if I get a response for the one that's configured immediate, then the other one doesn't need to worry about it. But if I don't get a response, that machine will still get serviced, right? So interesting options that you can do there. Okay, so I've got this configured. The other thing about configuring WDS and Pixie, right? So most routers, by default, all routers that I know of, are not configured to forward Pixie boot requests. That is something you could turn on, right? And so the idea is, if you are on a single subnet, your machine is going to send out a Pixie broadcast, and it's going to get no response unless there's a Pixie server local. But if you turn on routing to allow that Pixie request to go out, known as IP helpers, then you could have a subnet that doesn't have a Pixie server, but yet the router forwards that on to a subnet that does have a Pixie server, right? That's the supported way to route, if you will, Pixie requests. There's another way you can do it with some DHCP options that I've seen folks do, but it's not something that's supported. It's not something that we've tested that I know of, and certainly not supported. So, and I have seen some issues, with it. So it's kind of a use at your own risk kind of thing. If you want to go that way, I would strongly urge you to use IP helpers because that is fully supported. Okay. So now that we've got this going, let's go back to our bare metal system, and we're going to Pixie boot it. So a couple of things before I Pixie boot it. So you're going to notice whenever I Pixie boot this box, whenever I start it up, it's going to come up and ask me to press F12. The reason it even stops and asks me to press F12 is because the deployment that I have is not required, right? It is optional. If it were required, it would allow you to go ahead and image immediately. Oh, and that actually, before I do that, let me show you. That reminds me of something else I forgot to show you. So if you come back over here to Software Library, under Task Sequences, Create Task Sequence Media, one option I didn't show you as I was going through. Notice this one down here. So in ConfigMgr 2007, this option wasn't there. We would just run if we had a required deployment. Here, for the boot media, you have an option. You can choose whether or not to allow that to happen, which is a good safeguard, but it's not enabled by default, right? So at least be sure or be aware that it's there, right? So I'm going to do that. Okay, so back to the F12. So if I pull my system back in and start this action, start, it's going to come up and hopefully get a Pixie response this time. And I'm going to press F12 as soon as it does. There it is. So F12. And now we should start downloading the boot media, PE, and then reboot into it, and we'll have the same experience that we had before, except I'll have to stop and select the task sequence, right? While this is loading, another thing about Pixie Server, so again, this is a little bit more dangerous. If you have unknown computer support, you could have someone plug into the network, Pixie Boot, and start to get your images, right? Probably not something you want. So one of the things that you can do that I like to protect certain key machines, maybe the executives in your organization, from Pixie Boot, is to put an exclusion list on your Pixie server. So that would certainly have that Pixie server, that WDS server, filter out those requests and not respond to it, right? So you can look that up and do more of that later, but let's watch this work. So we're going to let this run. It's booting back into Windows PE. I'm going to have to tell it what task sequence to run, and then I'm going to let it start to run that task sequence, and then I want to show you just in the log really quick how we do show that we will that we booted from Pixie this time instead of booting from that media. So I'm going to click next, and off we go. It's running. So let me go get this. There we go. So capture that in, and just really quick here. Okay, so I'm going to have to restart. That's an error. Who cares? Booted from network, Pixie, right there. Right, so it tells you right away what we do. Right, so I don't know what that error was. Probably doesn't. I don't know what it is. Who cares? Cool. So notice I clicked restart, and it doesn't restart because I have this window open. As soon as I close it, it does restart. So good enough. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back off. So that's Pixie Boot. Well, one thing I want to show you about Pixie Boot. Remember I mentioned the MAC address and the SMBIOS address are key. Well, you see that in the log. So if you're looking at Pixie and you want to troubleshoot what it's doing and wondering why it's not getting a response, whatever, you can come into the ConfigMgr logs and go down to the SMS Pixie. And here is the log. So if we go look at that, we should be able to, in production it'll be busier, but in mine, go up to the top of this loop and we'll see. Here comes in a request, right? We don't have any IP address stuff assigned right now because we're probably just going through DHCP at the moment. We're going and trying to get some information about it, posting some information about it. Here's some detail about whether we allow unknown support or not. We in fact find that this machine is in the database. So here's the MAC address. Here's the SMBIOS. We don't have to have both, just either one. And we in fact found the device in the database. So then we have a reply, and we'll tell it different information that we have about it. So I just had one deployment available to it now, so that's all you see here. But then off we go, and that's how we, that is kind of the behind the scenes. If you turn on SQL tracing, you'd see more about it. Profiler for sure. I can't remember if this has SQL tracing enabled. I think it does. Pretty sure it does. You can see the SQL calls as we're making them, trying to look up these machines and that kind of thing. But this is a key log for troubleshooting Pixie if you're not getting a successful boot, a successful option, right? Okay, so another kind of way that we can deploy is to create standalone media, right? Standalone media is one that is very similar to what we just did. The difference here, though, is we expect no network access. Right? Whereas the boot image itself is just Windows PE, so it's very small. The standalone media is Windows PE plus anything else that is necessary to get that image deployed. Right? So it could be applications or packages or whatever, scripts, whatever it is that you need, it's all going to be embedded in that ISO that you create or that USB stick, right? So we'll see that in a minute. But going through this process is exactly the same. I've got, well, mostly the same. I've got this already created, so I won't do it live, but you can at least see the process. So we're going to go through this. Security again, do I want a password? Probably on Standalone Media, a good idea. Here's the difference. We're going to select a task sequence. This is the task sequence we're going to run. And you can tell that these are the items that need to be accessible on the ISO, right? So we're going to have to make those a part of the ISO. We can also, for applications, include dependencies on the ISO. Here's the distribution points we can add, just one. This one has all three of them, so that's good. Click Next. Here's that other screen to add in whatever you want, and then we would create the media. Well, I've already got the media, so I'm going to exit this and come back out to my bare metal machine. So if I go to Settings, then here I can change the DVD drive to point to the Standalone Media. And here you see just the size difference, 3.14 gig versus 269 megs. So definitely a bigger ISO. I'm going to choose that, hit OK, and then we're going to boot. So the Standalone Media does not expect that you would have any, I'm going to exit that, doesn't expect that you would have any network connectivity. I'm going to hit a key to boot from that ISO. Now, you could do a scenario where you have Standalone Media, but you do have network connectivity, and you engineer your task sequence to kind of take advantage of that hybrid type environment. But the intention of Standalone Media is not to have any network access. There's some uniquenesses about Standalone Media and that fact, meaning you have to have all of your content local. We really can't download anything, so it has to be in that ISO. There's some places in the task sequence that can get a bit interesting to make sure that we have that content, but nevertheless. So here we click Next. We already know this was built. We're just confirming that's the one we want. We start off and off we go. It's going to start partitioning. It's going to image. It's all running local. All right, so a great thing to have in your tool belt for those places where network connectivity is non-existent or flaky. All right. So all done with that, so I'm going to turn that off. So I'm done with bare metal, and we'll move out of that. Right. Now, the last thing that I want to show you is this whole reimage thing. Right. So it's exactly the same process, nothing different really about it at all, except that I've got this image now deployed to my Windows 8 collection, which means it shows up in Software Center. Now, I don't have to come in here and interact. I can make it required, and it would just run. But I could also come in here and tell it to install. It's going to warn me, say, hey, you're about to install an OS. Do you want to do that? And I can say, yeah, go ahead. And so you'll notice it's going to start the process. It's going to start downloading. It will take a little bit to download PE. And then once we get PE downloaded, once we get PE staged, it's going to reboot the system and load PE and start to image. Right? So again, the process of imaging, no matter where you start, you want to get into Windows PE. Yeah, for a deployment-based, a reimage type scenario, again, those kind of scenarios would be reinstalling an OS that's already on the machine because there are problems, or upgrading from one OS to another, or replacing the hardware, or whatever. There certainly are valid things that we would do while we're in the running OS, maybe collect user state or system state or something like that. But as soon as we do those precursor things that need to be done while we're in the running OS, we're going to reboot the system, get right into Windows PE, and wipe the disk and start imaging, because that's where we do the image process, right, in Windows PE. I said before, whenever we started this discussion, you can engineer OSD to look like an upgrade. In fact, there's a scenario called upgrade. But it's not an upgrade. We never upgrade the OS. We always wipe the old OS and reload, even if it's the same version of the OS, right? So to the end user, when you build this right, it could look perfectly like an upgrade. But in reality, it's a complete wipe and reload, right? So with that said, you see I'm almost done here, and it might even finish while I'm talking and wrapping up. But that really is the kind of end-to-end taking an image that we had already captured, deploying it, the various ways you can deploy it, and so on, right? So as we go forward now, we're going to start to build into this a little bit more complexity. So the next session, as an example, we'll start to talk about the logic that you can bring to bear in a task sequence to take it beyond just the basic task sequence that you're seeing me deploy now, and really injecting some logic into this thing so that we can roll. So you see that we're installing Windows PE right now, and then we'll reboot, right? So anyway, that's it for this session. So we'll put a bookmark here, and we'll pick up with some of that logic on the next session. See you then.